Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first build guide of Season 22 featuring Titan, and it includes two exotics I'm really excited to show you. One of which is the new exotic gauntlets with Pyrogale, which enhances our Burning Maul super to incredible amounts of burst DPS, and the other is Monte Carlo with its new exotic catalyst, which brings it into a really interesting position with melee builds in particular. Some brief highlights of the build include constantly spamming consecration melees over and over again, as well as having constant restoration and occasional cure for great survivability. On top of this, we also have some of the highest burst damage potential in the game thanks to Pyrogale gauntlets, and we take this even further to a small glitch that I'll actually show you in a bit, which can bring our damage to rival that of Star Eater scale Blade Barrage. Before we get into it, be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know down in the comments what you thought of this build guide, as well as any recommendations for future videos. I already have a Warlock and Hunter build in the works, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your support. Getting right into the subclass then, for super, Burning Maul is going to be a necessity for this build. Not only is Pyrogale going to enhance our super, making it a one-off variant of the typical roaming Burning Maul super, but the damage potential it actually allows it to have is kind of ridiculous. As long as you hit all the projectiles, the base damage is similar to that of a Cuirass Thunder Crash. It can go even further depending on the kind of enemy you're fighting, because there are multiple solar vortexes that are left over that can deal damage over time and even cause additional ignitions depending on what fragments you go with. On top of this, there's also an easy to perform glitch that I'll get into a little bit later when I talk about the gauntlet specifically, that can increase its damage potential by 50% and have it rival and even straight up beat Star Eater Blade Barrage's damage, which is normally the highest burst damage potential in the game. Onto your abilities then. For your melee charge, I'm going to go with Throwing Hammer. It's not that Hammer Strike isn't possible to use with this build, and it certainly is, but in my opinion, Throwing Hammer is just objectively better than Hammer Strike. Throwing Hammer is a pseudo infinite melee charge, and you can constantly reproc over and over again, and on top of this, it grants us cure periodically anytime we hit an enemy with it and then pick it up. And Hammer Strike, while it can cause scorch and ignition effects, we can already achieve that with our consecration aspect, and so we just don't really need Hammer Strike, and the ease of use and the, again, pseudo infinite effect that Throwing Hammer can have is just way more viable for this build. For your grenade, I'm personally going with the Firebolt grenade just because it's the easiest way to apply scorch stacks to a large group of enemies and has the fastest cooldown out of any solar grenade. If you want to go with a healing grenade, for example, for more survivability, or an incendiary grenade for more scorch stack potential, you can absolutely do that. Any grenade works great with this build. Onto the aspects, the first one that we're using today is Consecration. This will essentially replace our standard melee whenever we slide by allowing us to first rise up with our first use of our melee charge and send out a scorching AoE effect, and then using our melee charge again allows us to slam, sending out another scorching effect that will instantly ignite any scorched targets and deal a ton of damage. We also have a lot of ways that we can enhance this damage even further, and I'll get into that as it becomes relevant in the video, but just know that this is the one mandatory aspect with this build, and there are a few alternatives and different playstyles you can use to better fit it based on the activity that you're in. The other aspect I'm personally going with is Roaring Flames. In short, this will grant you a progressively stacking damage bonus as you get kills with your solar abilities, and this will also buff your super damage, and at times 3 stacks, it'll grant you a 73% increase to your total ability damage. And again, this is your grenade, this is your melee charge, this is your super, and this is also your consecration melee slam. Since this build can easily get consecration back instantaneously, if not within a few seconds of using it, this allows us to have constant Roaring Flame stacks at max stacks basically all the time, and this allows our consecration to hit way harder. However, if you don't want to focus on pure damage and would rather go with survivability, you can also swap Soul Invictus. This will essentially allow you to create sunspots anytime you get a solar ability kill or defeating a scorch target. Anytime you go into that sunspot, you'll get restoration, and enemies that enter it will also have scorch damage dealt to them over time. You also get some passive ability regen, but with having an infinite Throwing Hammer, it's not really the most important. But again, if you wanted better just intrinsic survivability, Soul Invictus over Roaring Flames is going to be the way to go. Onto the fragments then. The first one I'm using, and specifically for Roaring Flames, is going to be Ember of Mercy. This will allow you to get restoration anytime you revive an ally or you pick up a fire sprite. Again, if you're using something like Soul Invictus, you can swap this out for, say, something like Ember of Beams, which will enhance the tracking potential of any of the solar projectiles your super makes, or even something like Ember of Resolve, which allows your solar grenade final blows to grant you cure. So in short, if you're going with Roaring Flames for more damage, simply use Ember of Mercy to have the same restoration effect that Soul Invictus can apply for you. If you're going with Soul Invictus, swap this out for any other kind of support fragment based on your playstyle. For the other three though, we're going with Ember of Searing, and this allows any scorched target defeat to grant us melee energy, and this also generates a fire sprite upon killing them. This is how we actually get the fire sprites for Ember of Mercy, and even without using this for Ember of Mercy's restoration effect, we also get our intrinsic melee energy back anytime we defeat a scorched target, which means that causing ignitions from scorched enemies or using our melee, for example, will intrinsically get us our scorched energy back very quickly. But the main reason we're using this, regardless of which aspect you go with, is because defeating scorched targets will grant you melee energy, and specifically through your consecration melee, this allows us to get a huge chunk of our melee back just by using it from our intrinsic effects rather than mod components. And when we combine this with mods like Melee Kickstart, for example, and our exotic for today, this is what allows us to get our Consecration Slam back basically instantaneously. We're also using Ember of Char, which allows our solar ignitions to spread scorch stacks to other affected targets. This allows us to have much better chaining potential with ignitions, and also again feeds back into Ember of Searing, allowing us to get a lot more melee energy back very quickly. Finally, we're using Ember of Empyrean, and this will just simply keep up the effect of Restoration as we get solar ability and solar weapon final blows. And again, if you're using Sol Invictus, this just naturally works with it. If you're using Roaring Flames, combining this with Ember of Mercy is what gives us the infinite restoration effects. Now, if you wanted to, you could always swap one of these out and use Ember of Torches instead, and using Ember of Empyrean combined with it would allow you to have Ember of Torches and the radiant effect it provides up forever. But the main reason we're not using it is because, again, this is an ability-focused playstyle, and honestly, with our exotic weapon having a seasonal artifact that lets it intrinsically be anti-barrier champion, there's really no reason to use Ember of Torches besides just having a basic weapon damage bonus, but that doesn't really fit in well with this build. But just keep in mind, you can use this if you want to, specifically for champions, or if you just have a weapon you want to have Radiance effect applied to. Briefly going over the artifact mods that are really relevant for this build, the first one I'm going to go with is Monochromatic Maestro. Basically, when you deal elemental ability damage, matching elemental weapon damage is boosted by 10% for 5 seconds, and vice versa. So essentially with this build, you can put on a solar weapon and swap back and forth between it, and this allows your abilities and your solar weapon damage to be boosted by 10%. Keep in mind, the 5-second timer is not refreshable, but there's no delay once it actually goes away. So as long as you just keep swapping between these damage types and the ability and weapon damage, you're able to just chain this 10% bonus basically indefinitely. On top of this, we're also going with Elemental Embrace, and this will basically grant you plus 50 recovery and a 50% subclass magic damage resistance. So in this case, you have a intrinsic 50% damage resistance to all solar damage anytime that you have an elemental buff granted to you. This elemental buff for us can be Restoration or Radiant, and since we have Restoration up constantly, we basically always have plus 50 recovery and a 50% damage resist to solar damage. The one thing I want to note about Elemental Embrace though is it doesn't work with any other subclass buffs, meaning that if a teammate is running Strand and has a way to grant you Woven Mail, you won't get a Strand resist if they grant you Woven Mail. It'll only work for Restoration or Radiant being on a solar subclass. As far as the other mods I'm using, the first one is Elemental Orb Solar, and this will just occasionally drop a solar elemental orb upon getting solar weapon blows. This is a nice kind of AoE effect that you can throw and just grant more scorch damage, and again, defeating these scorch enemies can grant you melee energy and cause ignitions. On top of this, I'm also using Refreshing Pickups, just so whenever we do pick up a solar elemental orb, it grants us more ability energy for our least chargeability. I'm also using Communal Pickups, but this isn't needed for this build. Basically, when an ally picks up your solar elemental orb, you get a bonus to your weapon damage for 10 seconds, specifically to your solar weapons. Again, it's not needed, but it's a nice quality of life thing to have that can just provide you random enhancements to your weapons. And then finally, I'm using Elemental Fury, which while a champion is stunned, it takes bonus damage from your abilities. In this case, it can be our super, it can be our melee, such as our Consecration Slam or our grenade, as well as any elemental orb damage that's done to them, which can come from our own solar elemental orbs. Getting right into the armor and the mod sin for today. Starting off on our helmet, we have 2 stacks of hands-on, and this allows us to get our super back very quickly from, again, our infinitely chaining melee kills. And then we also have Harmonic Siphon, which allows our solar weapons to grant us orbs of power on final blows, and this will allow us to get additional orbs of power as we swap to our solar weapon to chain Monochromatic Maestro. Onto our gauntlets, and our exotic today is Pyrogale Gauntlets. In short, this makes Burning Maul into a one-off super, essentially putting out a similar damage to a Cuirass Thunder Crash Titan, but into a single heavy slam that fires off a bunch of cyclones of flame. These will deal damage over time after the initial impact and can even cause additional ignitions. On top of this, the Consecration Slam will also generate a Cyclone of Flame that does similar things where it seeks out an enemy and can cause additional scorch damage and even further ignitions. As I mentioned earlier, Pyrogale puts out similar damage when all of these cyclones actually hit to Cuirass Thunder Crash on Titan, and the way that you can actually get more damage is very simple. Simply pop your super with Pyrogale equipped and you'll retain the one-off damage effect even if you swapped away from these gauntlets. And so what you can do is pop your super with Pyrogale, which again will make your super the one-off variant, go to Synthoceps, swap over to it, and then use your super when you're surrounded. This will grant you the 50% damage bonus provided by biotic enhancements and essentially make your super one of the highest DPS supers in the entire game. Even without the Synthoceps swap glitch, the damage Pyrogale outputs is absolutely incredible. Again, there is some variance on bosses, specifically larger and mobile bosses will take more damage over time because they're unable to move out of the way of the cyclones, compared to faster bosses, think something like Ralk versus Riven, for example. For the mods on the gauntlets though, I'm personally going with a stack of heavy-handed, allowing our Consecration melee slams and just our general powered melees from our Throwing Hammer or our Roaring Flames melee to generate orbs of power on final blows, and I'm also using 2 stacks of melee kickstart just to use up any stacks of armor charge we have to grant us a lot of instantaneous melee regen when we use our melee ability. Combining 2 stacks of melee kickstart with our intrinsic melee regen I went over earlier in the video allows us to often get our full melee energy charge back instantly after we use it. In case we don't though, there are some other ways that we can get a lot of melee energy very quickly, and I'll get into that later. For our chest piece, there really isn't any need to use reserve mods because this build primarily looks at abilities and ability spam, and so you can really fit this out however best fits for you. I'm using a stack of charged up just so we can get a maximum of 4 stacks of armor charge, meaning we can get the most out of our melee kickstart mods, as well as using 2 resists that are just dependent on whatever activity I'm doing. For our legs, the first one we're using is stacks on stacks, and this will grant us an extra stack of armor charge when we pick up an orb of power, meaning that instead of getting 1 stack of armor charge, we get 2. On top of this, I'm also using recuperation, which will grant us a small bit of health every time we pick up an orb of power, and invigoration, which grants us a small bit of melee energy whenever we pick up an orb of power as well. Again, another way we can get our melee energy back very, very quickly. An alternative to any of these mods that would work well with this build is also elemental charge, and this will grant you a progressively escalating chance that whenever you actually pick up your fire sprite, it'll grant you a stack of armor charge, and this would work with something like stacks on stacks, meaning that picking up a fire sprite could occasionally grant you 2 stacks of armor charge if you wanted to use that as well. Finally, for our mark, there really aren't any important options to use here, so you can really build this out to whichever way you want to go with this build. The first one I'm going with is Reaper, which basically guarantees our next final weapon blow after we use our class ability will generate an orb of power, and also powerful attraction, which allows us to collect any nearby orbs of power when we use our barricade. And then finally, I also have outreach on, again another way to regen melee energy. Just by using our class ability, we get some melee energy back intrinsically. Getting into the weapons I would highly recommend for this build. Starting off, we have our exotic with Monte Carlo. This is something that has been a staple for melee builds across the board for years now, and only very recently at the start of the season did it finally get a catalyst, which has made it one of the most interesting design choices, I think, of any exotic weapon in Destiny history. Essentially, when you get 5 stacks of Markov Chain, which you can get by getting 5 kills with a weapon, or get 5 stacks instantly upon getting a melee kill, you special reload and you can essentially have a bayonet hit that deals a ton of melee damage. And once you deal damage with the bayonet, it'll actually grant you an intrinsic 50% melee energy just for free, which is another way that we can get our melee back instantaneously if we didn't already through intrinsic and mod effects. On top of this, getting a melee kill with the bayonet charge will also reset the stacks of Markov Chain, meaning that you can just recharge the bayonet strike and go again and again and again. The damage that this outputs is around 100,000 for my normal testing, and even in something like Legend and Master content when I'm already under light significantly being early in the season, it allows you to easily one-shot any minor enemy and even some majors depending on the content and other modifiers. The nice thing too is Markov Chain also grants this weapon a damage boost as we get more stacks, and also anytime that you deal damage with the weapon in general, it also will slowly grant you melee energy. So you don't even need to get a kill with this weapon, just simply dealing damage with it will gradually refill your melee charge. Like I mentioned earlier too, since we don't have Radiant with this build, we can't pop barrier champion shields, but since auto rifles are intrinsically anti-barrier this season, this means that this will actually take care of any barrier champions and is a great way for us to get our melee charge back instantaneously. On top of that, our Ignition Slam coming from Consecration can also stagger unstoppable champions, and I'm using an LMG in the heavy slot personally, and this allows me to actually stagger overload champions thanks to more seasonal mods. The other exotic I really want to recommend with this build is Tractor Cannon. This is simply used just to get the most damage potential out of your Consecration Slam and your Super Pyrogale Slam. In short, it'll provide a 30% debuff, meaning that your damage from Consecration and from your Pyrogale Super will deal 30% more damage, and it provides you a small movement bonus, which could be beneficial with how this build actually plays out. For legendary weapons though, really anything with Incandescent works perfect with this build, as not only can it help generate ignitions for just great AoE damage and ad clear, but also helps us generate more melee energy back upon getting kills. Something like Unwavering Duty or even the Fixed Odds craftable LMG works just fine for this, but if you want to use Fixed Odds for example, because again it is craftable, you can use it with Feeding Frenzy and Incandescent for a similar effect. I also have Judgment of Kel'Grath here, which is a glaive. I have it with Demo and Incandescent just to help with our grenade regen. However, there are tons of other weapons that can also roll with Incandescent, stuff like Retraced Path. You could also use something like Callous Mini Tool that I have here that has Grave Robber and Incandescent. For other exotics, you can also use something like Tommy's Matchbook or Prometheus Lens to apply those Scorch stacks very easily. But realistically, I feel that Monte Carlo is the best fit for this build, as again, not only does it have its own high burst damage melee option, but it also perfectly feeds into Consecration Slam with Pyrogale Gauntlets. No matter what weapons you use with this build though, it is still one of the greatest currently in the game. Not only do we have really high burst damage coming from our Consecration Slam and our Pyrogale Super, but we also have a ton of healing effects coming from Constant Restoration and Occasional Cure. We also have some basic solar weapon support and tons of ad clear with ignition effects and other scorching effects. Plus we also have a ton of intrinsic super regen, which allows us to get one of the hardest hitting super damage options in the entire game back very, very quickly. And again, with a simple glitch, we can have some of the highest burst damage potential in Destiny 2 just by swapping the synthoceps when we activate our super and swapping back. This is one of my favorite Titan builds I've made in recent memory, just because consecration, in my opinion, wasn't very strong at first, and finally we have an exotic that pairs greatly with it to enhance it even further, and with the Monte Carlo rework, it fits in perfectly with the melee regenning aspect that this build provides. This is a build that I think works great in basically any level of content, as well as solo play or with a fire team, and is something I'm 100% going to be using for the day 1 raid. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this, and let me know down in the comments what you thought of the build, as well as any recommendations for future builds. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm working on a Warlock and a Hunter video, so stay tuned for that. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you, and have a great day.